The following presentation is a love story. My wife, Kathy, and I have lived at 97 Glengrove Avenue West for over 27 years. We love Victorian architecture, and we've done our best to preserve it in the asset that has been entrusted to us. So it occurred to me that I should research the history of this house and share it with others. As a teaser to get started, I learned that our house was built not in the city of Toronto, but in the town of North Toronto. This was an amalgam of three separate villages before it: Eglinton, Davisville, and Bedford Park. This new entity, North Toronto, existed for only 23 years, from 1889 to 1912. But this short period of time lacks context. A complete understanding of the history of the house requires a more thorough investigation of what was going on in the neighborhood, the city, the province, the country, and even the landmass itself. There are a lot of interconnected parts to this story. The following presentation is a love story. My wife, Kathy, and I have lived at 97 Glengrove Avenue West for over 27 years. We love Victorian architecture, and we've done our best to preserve it in the asset that has been entrusted to us. So it occurred to me that I should research the history of this house and share it with others. As a teaser to get started, I learned that our house was built not in the city of Toronto, but in the town of North Toronto. This was an amalgam of three separate villages before it: Eglinton, Davisville, and Bedford Park. This new entity, North Toronto, existed for only 23 years, from 1889 to 1912. But this short period of time lacks context. A complete understanding of the history of the house requires a more thorough investigation of what was going on in the neighborhood, the city, the province, the country, and even the landmass itself. There are a lot of interconnected parts to this story. So let's begin our examination of North Toronto history. The scope covers four different periods: colonizers, who explored the land, ending up with the creation of the town of York; settlers, who lived on Lot 4 West; developers, who created Glengrove Park; and many homeowners who lived in and enhanced 97 Glengrove Avenue West. I've decided to tell these stories with a strict academic prism. It's important to understand the social, economic, political, and cultural influences that have yielded the history of what we call North Toronto today. Not. There's just a whole lot of very cool stories to tell. The first three are about the founding colonizers: the Wendat, the French, and the English. So let's begin. When you tell a history story, it's always hard to know where to start. So I thought I'd start at the beginning. Well, 13 billion years ago, there was a big dust storm. And it took until 4 billion years ago for the dust to congeal into a dust ball. And that's what we live on, the planet Earth. After some more time, plants, and then animals, and then trees, in that order, developed on the dust ball. And eventually the animals got bigger and bigger. And so 66 million years ago, there were woolly mammoths and mastodons making their home in North Toronto. Well, then three bad things happened. A comet fell on Mexico. A volcano erupted in India. These were the first two, and they happened about 66 million years ago. And then, boom, every animal over 55 pounds was dead. The third destructive thing that happened was 32 million years ago, when climate change happened. There was a big ice shield over North Toronto and very little else. Then global warming happened. Back then it was a good thing, and it turned the glacier into Lake Iroquois. And about 2 million years ago, the first people on the planet, not here but in Africa, developed, and it took until 5000 BC for the Clovis people to migrate over the Bering Strait to come to North Toronto and discover it. So over the next 6,000 years, the Clovis people evolved into, amongst others, the Iroquois Confederation in Upper New York State, and they developed trading posts in southern Ontario, including North Toronto. Here's a picture of what a village looked like at the Jake site. The Quandat or Wendat or Wyandot Aboriginal village of longhouses. We know this, of course, because there was an archaeological dig here, including the help of many North Toronto women. They were able to unearth artifacts. The articles included clay pots, not a surprise to North Toronto gardeners, as we're obviously endowed with a lot of clay here. Cornelius Krieghoff painted a picture of a Huron-Wendat scout, and the clay was traded with other tribes as one basis of their existence here. Here's a picture of the actual village site. There were 30,000 people living here in 1650, basically around Castlefield and Avenue Road, very near the current Allenby School, surrounded by a wooden palisade. Well, I looked at Google Maps for the exact same territory, and I counted up all the houses, and I figured out the number of people living here now. So just as a question, what do you think the population density was of the Wendat versus today? Do you think they were 1/3 of our density, or about the same, or 3 times as much? Well, the answer is that their density was 3 times as much as it is today. And you can get a sense of that by looking inside a longhouse. It was pretty crowded. There were 40 people living in each longhouse. And so perhaps, in part as a result, there was a migration in 1550 where a bunch of the Wendat moved up to Collingwood. The first cottage-goers, I suppose. They were in turn destroyed by the Iroquois in 1650, and then they went all over the place, including as far away as Oklahoma.
En roulant ma boule roulant, en roulant ma boule, en roulant ma boule roulant, en roulant ma boule. Derrière chez nous, y a qu'un étang, en roulant ma boule.
In the early 1600s, the French were well established in Lower Canada. You'll recognize that immediately because it's the upper part of the map. But they wanted to explore into Upper Canada because more beaver pelts equaled more money. But to do that, they had to navigate a very tricky river network to get around at that time. There's obviously no roads. And they didn't know where they were going. So Champlain found a young buck. He was 17 years old. His name was Etienne Brulé. He was one of only 8 people who survived the winter of 1608, and he was good with languages. And he said, and he was told, well, go live with the Algonquins for 2 years, which he did. He came back and maps were developed. This is the first map that refers to Toronto. It said Toronto Lake, and if you took a portage, then you can get down to a bigger lake. And of course, it's stored in Paris. If you want to see this, you have to go to Paris. Well, based on that intelligence, the French came down by canoe the Humber River and did discover Lake Ontario and established a fort or a trading post in Fort Toronto. This was in 1750. Interestingly, it was the sort of first political map of blue versus red states today, and it was blue versus red forts back then, the blue being French and the red being British. And the strategic role of Fort Rouillé was to divert trade from Fort Oswego down in New York, and it was very successful at doing so. If you want to see where the fort was originally, you can go to the CNE and see this statue or marker that's still there. Poor Etienne Brulé, however, in 1634, he made the fatal mistake of trading with the Iroquois, and the Huron were furious, and they apparently, according to the CBC vignette, tortured, killed, and ate him. Let's start the story of the British in 1776. Spoiler alert, they fought a war with the American colonies and they lost. Well, the consequence of that is that there was a flood of people who wanted to come up to Canada, including United Empire Loyalists and Americans. Here's a poem from 1777, the Hungry Year. They came in exodus to our Canadian wilds, full of heart and hope, with heads erect and fearless eyes, victorious in defeat. They forced their way through the silent woods to defend and keep forever their own and England's till the end of time. Here's a letter that was sent back to England talking about the influx of Americans. Englishmen, who have in general been accustomed to subordination and habituated to a decent, orderly, and respectful deportment, find a difficulty in reconciling themselves to the manners and customs of the former republicans, who have a certain vulgarity and contemptuous arrogance, united to ignorance and illiberality about them, which is disgusting. Well, good thing that times have changed. What happened with this influx is that Sir John Johnson figured, well, I better formalize our land ownership here, and he proceeded to pay £1,700 sterling to the Mississauga Indians for the Toronto Purchase. Here's a copy of the agreement that was made. It's obviously a valid legal document because everybody signed it, and Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe then proceeded to do three important strategic things. First, he decided to build Fort York, and this was to bolster the British presence because they had just, in an unforeseen way, lost the American colonies, and they didn't want to lose this British colony. Second, he commissioned a road north to Lake Simcoe. Why? This was actually a military decision. It was a shortcut up to the upper Great Lakes, and it was really the first provincial highway. Third, he instituted a system of land grants for the United Empire Loyalists, and that required a whole lot of surveying to take place. So to take them one at a time, here's a map that shows that Simcoe actually went up to Lake Simcoe to, it wasn't named that at the time, to just see what was there. And he followed the ancient fur trading path, the carrying place, the portage that we saw earlier from the French map, and then came back down and then said, well, I know what I'm going to do. I just traversed a whole bunch of rivers, a whole bunch of valleys. I'm going to build me a straight road. And that was the origin of Yonge Street. And they proceeded to cut down trees. Trees were the enemy. Here's a couple quotes from 1800. The road was not passable for any carriage on account of the logs. The pines were up to 6 feet in diameter, and the largest were 500 years old. Nothing grew at the base. A solemn roar could be heard day and night. Well, in 1800, Simcoe passed the Stump Act, and this formalized the practice of using convicts, mostly alcohol offenders, to remove stumps on public road projects. He did another thing to help with the clearing of the land, and this has to do with the settlers and the giving away of lots. There were three conditions to receiving a lot from the Crown. First, you had to build a dwelling hoof, whatever that is. Second, you had to clear and fence 5 acres. And third, you had to help with Yonge Street and clearing some of the trees and stumps. So the first Surveyor General in Ontario was somebody called David William Smith, and he was only 28 years old, but he received 2.5% of all the monies that were paid for the lots that were allocated, and using that, he proceeded to acquire 20,000 acres over 21 counties. But he did something that was very helpful. The checkerboard that you see here laid out a grid that allocated to the Crown and clergy. This was part of the Canada Act, where out of every 7 lots that were given, 1 had to be given to the Crown and 1 had to be given to the Church. So how do you do that in a way that all townships are distributed equally and fairly? So this checkerboard meant that there's 5 for you, 1 for the Crown, 1 for the Church, and then repeat. In terms of surveying, there was a remarkable example of integrity that's worth mentioning. Charles Rankin, you can see a plaque honoring him in Thornbury, because that's where he eventually settled down and resided. He invented a system of paying surveyors a flat fee per 1,000 acres surveyed. Prior to that, surveyors were given 4% of the land. And so they would just cut deals with the local settlers and benefit themselves and the local settlers. And it was riddled with corruption. This system, prior to that, it was all paid for by the military. The military was incurring the cost of surveying up until the 1818, and that's when they introduced it was just cheaper to give the surveyors 4% and not have to pay for it themselves. Well, by 1830, the clearing had progressed significantly. Up until 1810, not much had been cleared, even though lots had been given away for a full decade. But by 1830, what had happened is that broadly distributed land was given to industrious settlers loyal to the Crown. And Yonge Street was really a predetermined concept, and the importance of it attracted settlement. And wherever the concessions crossed, like Eglinton, people formed villages. And that leads to the story of the first Lytton Park resident on Lot 4 West. So that's how Eglinton was born. Davisville and Bedford Park were in exactly the same way. They were colonized by the Wendat, the French, and then the British. Now, some cool stories about the settlers who moved into those lots that were surveyed and granted. Lot 4 West from 1803 to 1807 had just 3 different owners: John McDougall, a pair of Barbados gentry, and James Beattie. Let's look at each of their stories individually. Well, let's talk about the early settlers of Lot 4 West. Here you see a caricature of John McDougall. The paintings of him have all disintegrated because his countenance was so stern. His grandson, William McDougall, grew up on Lot 4 West, used to talk to friends about playing in what is today Alexander Muir Park. William McDougall had a very dramatic history himself. In 1863, he was invited personally by Abe Lincoln to attend the Gettysburg Address. He was representing Canada, negotiating a treaty in the U.S. In 1867, he was a Father of Confederation and attended all 3 conferences. And in 1869, he was the person who went to the Red River with a whole bunch of surveyors from Ontario and was rejected by Louis Riel. And in 1870, he was still miffed about that and voted against Manitoba being introduced into Confederation. Well, his wife, of course, Minnie, lived through all this, and you can tell that from her enigmatic smile, which is very Mona Lisa-like. Well, let me go on and talk about John McDougall, who was he was actually granted Lot 3, not Lot 4. He built a log cabin and barn there, and in 1811 he sold Lot 3 to Martin Snyder, who proceeded to build the Snyder House that's there today, and the McDougalls developed Lot 4 at that time. Let's take a look at an actual petition for a land grant. This is by Sarah McDougall, the wife of John McDougall. To His Excellency, John Grave Simcoe Esquire, Lieutenant Governor and Commander-in-Chief of the Province of Upper Canada, in Council, the petition of Sarah McDougall, humbly herewith. That your petitioner is wife of John McDougall, at present living at Digby in the province of Nova Scotia, farmer, where he's resided with his family, now consisting of 4 children, since the year 1783, when your petitioner with her husband left New York. He having served as conductor in the Quartermaster General's Department of His Majesty's forces during the whole time of the rebellion. That your petitioner's husband, desirous to remove with his family to Upper Canada now, whilst he should dispose of his flock of cattle, requested your petitioner, who has relations in this province, to precede him, and to endeavour to obtain a piece of land whenever he might settle with his family. Your petitioner therefore humbly prays that your Excellency would be pleased to grant her, in behalf of her said husband, a lot of ground in the town and township of Toronto, and your petitioner, as in duty bound, shall ever pray. Sarah McDougall, Newark, 28th of June, 1793. Newark, of course, being Niagara, the capital of the province. Well, fair enough. Poor wife Sarah had to come to Toronto all on her own and file a petition for a land grant, and in June 1793, and we would all hope that she would get it. But let's see what happened following that. Well, John eventually did rejoin her in York, and when he came, he applied for himself, and he was allotted 200 acres in addition to what Sarah had already been granted. Following that, John said, well, that's not quite enough, so I'd kind of like 200 more, please. He filed another petition. He received it. And after that was granted, he said, well, it's working pretty well so far. He filed again and said, you know, I've got 4 children, and I don't really have enough land, so he filed requesting 300 more acres, and he was granted that also. Well, move forward to 1806, 1807 time period. DUE stands for Daughter of a United Empire Loyalist, and the daughter of John and Sarah, Mary, she got to file for property as well, and she did. And just to make sure that everything was above board and, you know, was going to work, John refiled just to revalidate. He basically sent a letter in saying, remember me, I fixed those wagons when we were fighting those rebellious Yankees, and just so you know, got that put on record. And the following week, Anne, his other daughter, filed, and she received her lot of land. Moved forward a couple of years, they had another daughter, and she said, well, I want my land too, so she filed and got her 200 acres, and SUE is son of a United Empire Loyalist. John filed, he got his land. Moved forward to 1816 to 1819. Another daughter, Sarah, she wanted her land. A son, Daniel, who was the father of William, he filed, he received his land. And another daughter, Hannah, she filed, she got her land. They must have had a lot of children and late children, because Helen in 1829 also filed, and she also received her land. It wasn't until 1838 that John McDougall actually bought a piece of land, and interestingly, it was with the proceeds from the sale in 1837 of Pilgrim's Farm, and he actually put some money out to obtain another 200 acres of land. So you get a car, and you get a car, and everybody gets a car. Except they weren't giving out cars, they were giving out lots the size of the Mount Pleasant Cemetery, which is the only remaining intact 200-acre allotment in Toronto. And in total, there were 82,000 petitioners, and if each one of them received 200 acres, that equals the size of New Brunswick. We're talking about a lot of land that was given away by the Crown. With so much land being given away, there was likely to be some messy politics involved, and there were. So let's examine all the players in this game. We start with King William IV. His house was 3,500 miles away, but it was his land that was being distributed. In June 1837, he died and left no legitimate heirs, but he did leave 8 illegitimate ones. So the crown passed to his niece, Victoria. Here she is receiving the news, and here she is at her coronation the following year. Well, what did this mean for the York settlers? They were pawns in this chess game, and they were governed by a 19-year-old girl on the other side of the Atlantic. There were established landholders who had resided here for decades. They were the castles in this game, people like William Lyon Mackenzie, a farmer, but also a publisher of a newspaper. The next important player is the bishop, Bishop John Strawn to be precise. He oversaw the allocation of 1/7 of all the land that was surveyed, the clergy reserve, and he wasn't shy about assigning it to only Anglicans. Guess how that made all the Scottish Presbyterian folk feel? The other 1/7 of land, the Crown Reserve, was overseen by the bureaucracy on behalf of young Queen Victoria. She was pretty busy receiving courtship proposals. They were called the Family Compact, and they had power in all directions, just like a queen piece in a chess game. So 33 families constituted the top 1% of society, not dissimilar to today. Even Charles Dickens described the situation as rabid and seriously appalling when he visited Toronto in 1842. The edicts of the Family Compact could even override the elected assembly. So if you wanted a road built to the lot that you just purchased, well, good luck trying to get it built through that vacant Crown Reserve. Pleading for better roads and better justice was attempted. For instance, Robert Gourlay, a land surveyor, wrote a list of grievances and presented it to the government. He was arrested for sedition, jailed in solitary confinement for 18 months, and then offered death or exile to be chosen within 24 hours. William Lyon Mackenzie criticized the government in his newspaper. His office was destroyed. Eventually, a £1,000 bounty was put on his head, too. Remember, this was all before the British North America Act and the phrase peace, order, and good government. So into this volatile mix, new game pieces were sought. This is the family crest of the Murray family. They were well-established gentry living in Barbados, hence Neptune at the top of it. They're represented in the game by the knight or horse, since they arrived from afar and served as rent-a-gentry. Other knights included rent-a-military. Here's a list of the Hessian Guard that supported Britain in their fight against the American rebels. Names like Franz Fetzer from Longin. They qualified as United Empire loyalists too. Snyder House, for instance, on Duplex, should really be called Schneider House. In 1815, the Duke of Wellington would have lost to Napoleon at Waterloo if it were not for the Prussian army. Nearly half of the army at Wellington's disposal spoke native German, and the British forces represented less than a quarter. So the top 10% of society in Upper Canada was being recruited from everywhere so that they could be overlorded by the established top 1%. So what do you get when you put all these pieces onto a game board? You guessed it, a rebellion. It was the Occupy movement of its day. It should have been called the North Toronto Uprisings. This is where the 1,000 rebels lived and farmed. They were marching with pitchforks, eventually suppressed by 1,000 troops with real guns. The significance of this event within North Toronto history was recaptured in the Hysterical Society newsletter of the time, which can be seen here. Being politically correct in 1837 meant distancing yourself from the former rebels. It's not a coincidence that Daniel McDougall chose to sell their farm on Lot 4 in that year when he was only 41 years old. He then moved north of present-day Lawrence Avenue. It was further away from the burnt-down reminder of Montgomery's Tavern. And William McDougall, his son, began his successful mainstream political career here, having witnessed firsthand from Lot 4 the suppression of the rebellion when he was just 15 years old. So let's talk a little bit about the importation of foreign aristocracy. Here's a popular book of the day, An Emigrant's Guide to Upper Canada, published in 1832. By locating themselves in the British colonies abroad, they soon acquire such capital as enables them to consume the various articles of export, and thus to contribute not only towards the increased employment of the manufacturers of England, but of the various classes of shipbuilders, provision merchants, sailors, etc., engaged in conveying manufactures to the colonies. Wow, the good of the empire came before the comfort of the individual. You just got to keep those factories humming. A man's industry is sure of full remuneration, where toil is recompensed to a degree which circumstances render utterly unattainable in other countries, and where he may easily acquire capital and independence. To me, this sounds like a Florida timeshare ad. It sounds too good to be true, and it was not true. I'm guiding you to Upper Canada and guarding you against the blunder you might otherwise commit by settling in the States. Accustomed to subordination, we must be disgusted at that terrible independence which makes the son conceive himself beyond the control of parental authority. Well, that's sour grapes. This was half a century after American independence, and the British are still licking their wounded pride. Now, let's turn our attention to slavery in the British Empire. There were 600 slaves in Upper Canada in 1790. They arrived as property with the United Empire Loyalists, and these property rights were protected by Upper Canada law. In 1793, poor Chloe Cooley, an enslaved black woman, was forcibly taken from Upper Canada to the United States to be sold. In Barbados, up until 1833, it was the underlying engine of the economy. Here's a description of how dependent the planters were on cheap slave labor. British West Indian planters were faced with rising labor costs and the inability to expand production. Cheaper sugar exports invaded European markets, from non-British Caribbean plantations, Latin America, such as Brazil, which didn't abolish slavery until 50 years later, and even as far away as India, which was considered free labor. So, three landed gentry families from Barbados decided to come to Upper Canada after the slaves were emancipated. These were rent-a-gentry families that the Family Compact sought. In 1836, Samuel Hewson bought Lot 5 East for £1,500. First thing he did was look for an architect to build him an imposing home to remind him of his palatial estate in the Caribbean. That wasn't too hard a task, since there was only one architect in Toronto at the time, John Howard. He had just built his own home in High Park, Colburn Lodge, and it looked quite wonderful. Here's John Howard in his youth, and here he is in a later age. A distinguished-looking gentleman like this must be able to design an estate befitting landed gentry. Well, here it is. Yikes! This is Kingsland. Henry de Scatting described it as an English-looking mansion of bricks with circular ends. To me, it looks like it was dropped into a barnyard from another planet. It was eventually torn down in 1910 to make room for Lawrence Park. It's at 0 Limestone Avenue. Hewson's neighbors across Yonge Street included two other Barbadian families, the Murrays and the Nantons. Davidson Monroe Murray's brother was the manager of the Barbados Colonial Bank, and his mother was a direct descendant of Lord Elgin, who borrowed those Elgin marbles from Athens. Upon arrival in 1837, Murray married the Hewson daughter, Mary Ann, and purchased Lot 4 West from the McDougals. He'd later sell this same property to the Nantons just 10 years later. Murray was an active member of society. He was an original founder of St. John's Anglican Church at York Mills, and also the local Freemason Lodge. He was also VP of the Toronto Turf Club, St. Leger Racetrack, which was near the present-day AGO. But the most notable contribution of Davidson Murray is that he renamed his estate on Lot 4 as Pilgrim's Farm, and he planted pine trees along the driveway leading to his house. 4 of those pine trees remain today, and in just 17 more years, it'll be the bicentenary of his visionary planting. Upper Canada was a society with a design. The attitude of the British government and its bureaucracy was to duplicate the aristocratic English model into Canada. This English model of large land estates controlled by aristocrats was contrary to the view of many immigrants, especially those from the United States. It was discriminatory and it was undemocratic. However, the British government did not want colonists to adopt the American attitudes and values. They feared another revolution. So the plan was to attract important aristocrats to Upper Canada. Often these were younger sons who had little hope of inheriting land in Great Britain. Here's how it was described in the book Opportunity Road, a book about Yonge Street. Simcoe wanted to recreate British society in Canada. He believed that an aristocratic governing class was essential to that goal. By limiting leadership positions in the colony to people with connections, it was hoped that a hierarchical class structure would arise. These men sought to solidify their personal positions into family dynasties and acquire all the marks of gentility. Similarly, historians have made the same observation. Upper Canada was created in the very image and transcript of the British. It did not have a hereditary nobility. In its place, the family compact made up this elite. In 1855, James Beattie, publisher of the Leader newspaper, bought Lot 4 from John Nanton. He owned the property until 1888, and during those 33 years, a lot happened. Here's a statue of James Sr. You can see him today in Leader Lane in downtown Toronto. This is right beside where the newspaper office was located. But James Beattie had his hands in a lot of different enterprises. As you can see, he was a real mover and shaker. He was a politician, served as councilman, alderman, and MP. He was a board member on the boards of Consumers Gas, Provincial Lunatic Asylum, Grand Trunk Railway, and he was an original founder of Toronto General Hospital. As a publisher, which he did for 26 years, he was against the clergy reserve, and he was for the 9-hour movement, which was to reduce the work day from 12 hours to 9 hours. And in decline, John A. Macdonald and his advocates started a newspaper called The Mail. And it eventually merged with the Globe. And today you read the Globe and Mail, but it could have been the Globe and Leader. He was an entrepreneur. He was a leather importer from New York. You can see that he had his ups and downs. His net worth diminished greatly in 1873. He was an activist. He was a flag bearer in the first Orange Parade. He founded many church parishes. As a landowner, he owned Lot 4 West. He renamed it Glengrove and made it his summer estate. And he also built 56 other houses. But in terms of cool stories, he was a scandal magnet. He was involved with the York Road scandal for 13 years and the Metropolitan Water and Gas scandal for 3 years. Let's examine the road scandal first. He agreed to pay £75,000 over 21 years, and in return, he obtained exclusive rights to collect tolls on the 3 main roads into Toronto. Here's what the politicians and newspapers had to say about that at the time. It was the boldest and most flagrant piece of corruption ever perpetrated by a Canadian government. That was William McDougall who said that. The dangerous character of these speculators, the deep undercurrent in the support of the councillors, that was what one of the councillors had to say about how James Beattie worked the city government to get what he wanted. Of all the numerous cases of executive malversation, this is the most daring and most flagitious. That was in the Globe. What the hell's flagitious anyway? Here's a toll notice. In 1851, it cost 6 pence for every vehicle drawn by 2 horses or other cattle, plus or minus adjustments for mules and asses. One toll keeper collected tolls by extending a half coconut attached to a stick, since travelers were sitting way up on top of the bales of hay. Here's a Krieghoff painting called Running the Toll, so as to avoid paying. This happened a lot and, of course, cut into revenues. One enterprising farmer who sold goods to Fort York and had to pass a toll gate every day just bought the property beside the toll booth and then built his own road around it. This Rebecca Street still exists today. And if you want to see a preserved toll booth, you can visit or rent it at Bathurst and Davenport, where it was restored and moved. Oh, yes, and that water and gas scandal, he gained the permission of city council to just go out and build the gas and water infrastructure for the city, and the city would reimburse him at the end of it whatever he paid, plus at least 20% more. That is a nice gig if you can get it. So that completes the cool stories relating to the settlement of North Toronto. Next comes three cool stories about a group of individuals who built and developed the area. King Dodds built a race course, Charles Warren built a radial tram line, and Nicholas Garland built a whole bunch of houses. Let's examine each of these. As they were pivotal years in the development of the neighborhood, we'll explore them one year at a time. First, 1887.